Hello and welcome to the Innovation Book Club, the podcast that makes sense of the big ideas that drive creativity and innovation. We're your hosts, Alex Drago and Wais Pirzad, and we believe that while there's never been a greater need for new ideas, perspectives and solutions, understanding exactly what innovation is and how it works has never been more difficult or confusing. So our purpose for this podcast is clear. In each episode, we take an important text from the innovation field, deconstruct it, and then talk through the key ideas to help you develop a more innovative mindset. The focus of this episode is Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. Right, so, the overview of the book is that it's not about innovation per se, because innovation is about the extraction of value from new ideas, but it's really about where those good ideas actually come from. And I think that's what's really interesting. Many books on innovation are tools-based approaches. This is not really a tools-based approach. It's really a human approach. And also he takes a very specific environmental approach. He says that, or his basic assumption is that ideas are the product of a set of environmental conditions, and humans are the people who naturally leverage that. And so what he's trying to do is create a sort of historic understanding about where good ideas come from. And from that, you can sort of derive some general lessons, I guess, and we'll talk about those a bit later. But it's 8 chapters. It's not an academic book. You could probably read it in an afternoon if you really wanted. In fact, half the book is an appendix, a big long list of innovations. But in the first one, the first chapter, he defines what innovation is, this idea of good ideas. And then he sort of talks about the environmental conditions that sort of support that.
The majority of innovation books I read were mainly focused on the tools itself and how it helped other successful startups innovate. And now this was the first book, I must say, that I read which outlined the innovation process or approach, you could say, by the environmental influences. It motivated me to read the book after especially reading about the historical facts he researched and outlined, like how the environmental factors influenced and led people to breakthrough innovation. That was the main reason why I liked it and started reading the book. It was the first book that did that, and the majority of other books were like, this is the process, these are the steps, A, B, C, D you have to go through, and it will lead you eventually to breakthrough innovations. And the reason the majority of books I liked, but always had my gut feeling like doesn't complete the whole picture of innovation. This book validated, or at least linked my gut feeling with it. I don't know if it's exactly that, but it really helped me to understand the human factor within innovation itself.
We'll get into it. For me, it sort of answers the so what question, right? So you read a business book, and I don't want to pick anyone in particular, but there'll be books that say innovation is about X.
Yeah.
And you read it and you go like, well, yeah, so what, right? How has that actually helped me to come up with a good idea? Well, it hasn't. It's told me about innovation, but it hasn't really increased my capability to innovate or to think innovatively. It's just taught me that you can use a tool or something like that in order to promote more innovative activities, I suppose. If we dip into the introduction, he kind of sets the scene, and he's a big fan of Darwin, right? And he begins the book on, it's Darwin, he's on the Beagle, it's 1836, he's on these islands, Keeling Islands, and basically he's looking out and he sees the coral reef, and he can recognize that there's something different about that, but what he can't explain is, where is all this life coming from? And it's really a key idea for him. And then he sort of jumps to this Swiss scientist called Max Kleber, who sort of works out this mathematical equation that basically leads us to the fact that all life forms have roughly the same number of heartbeats, but the bigger you are, the bigger the gap between the heartbeats. So life is not about years, it's about heartbeats. And then there's a guy, Geoffrey West, who then takes this. He tries to work out if the law that Kleiber has developed is applicable to sort of cities. The conclusion he actually comes to is that the relationship is there, but when you are talking about innovation and creativity, the bigger the city, the more innovative ideas there are, which of course answers why cities are such innovative places.
Yeah.
But he then goes on to explain that what he called the 10-10-10 rule, right? It used to be 10 years to come up with an innovation, 10 years to roll it out, right, for adoption. And the acceleration now is such that it's basically 1-to-1, right? 1 year to come up with an innovation, it takes you 1 year to actually roll it out, which means that the emphasis is not so much about what it takes to roll out an idea, it's how do you come up with ideas really quickly.
Exactly.
And that's really his starting point. So for him, the rest of the book is about the development of that idea. He begins chapter 1, it's this idea of the adjacent possible, which is, a really nice way to think about what innovation is, right, rather than the technical academic description. He tells a lot of story, right? He tells a story about how you can take one idea from one location and introduce it into another with a few changes, but essentially that's how ideas are birthed. So he gives the example in the 19th century in France, where infant mortality was high. Stéphane Tarnier goes to the zoo and he sees chickens are kept in this sort of heated environment, and he's like, I wonder if we can do this, right, with babies. And it turns out you can, and that's the birth of incubators. And then there's a sort of environmental or sort of sociological application. So you can't take the high technology of the West and then stick it in a developing country and say, well, here you go, and now you're not going to have any more child mortality. And he tells the story of when they tried to do that, of course, all the machines broke down. So actually the solution was to recreate the exterior of the incubator, but with technology that was common to that particular area, so that you could then, make sure that your incubators were always sort of working. And I think that's a really useful way to think about this idea of what actually innovation is. It's the adjacent possible. It's the next step. And it's something that's realistic, that can actually be implemented.
It's interesting that he also gives an example of the most recent developments like YouTube. And he says YouTube has been built on top of the World Wide Web when it was adopted and accepted and used by millions of people. So the adjacent possible of the World Wide Web was the natural development, or that people would want to share videos or see videos, was at the right time, at the right moment. That's at the YouTube has been introduced by those three founders, which was perfect moment and a perfect time. And that was a very interesting idea, because he also talked about if it's always the right time when you invent something. He talked about, I think it was Babbage, if I'm not incorrect.
That's right, yeah. So Charles Babbage is this sort of 19th century English polymath, right? He's this expert. And he comes up with this machine, I can't remember what it's called now. The difference engine. Is it called the difference engine? I think that's right. And essentially, it's a processor, right? But it's made with mechanical means. He knows this woman, Ada Lovelace, and she's essentially the programmer. And they create this incredibly complex machine, which ultimately they both walk away from, or at least he does, because the technology isn't actually there to either make it at scale or to implement it at scale.
Yeah, that's correct. It's interesting that he mentions this computer. It's the same, I think it was Apple that took over or copied, I don't know what term you could use best for it, from the user interface of Macintosh. They took from, I think it was Xerox.
That's right. Yeah.
When Xerox had invented that user interface based on a mouse. So it was also the adjacent possible, I think, I don't know, but to develop it further and make it available for the masses. And Xerox made it also available before Apple made their Macintosh, but it wasn't adopted by the masses. It wasn't rolled out on a big scale.
Yeah, so Xerox PARC, for anybody who's listening doesn't know, it's a part of Xerox, right? But it was their R&D facility. And basically by the mid-1970s, they'd sort of defined what home computing would actually look like in terms of desktop publishing, using the mouse, laser printers, things like that. But they had no business model or indeed any sort of manufacturing capacity in order to implement that. And it was Steve Jobs, right, who doesn't invent desktop publishing. He just licenses it from Xerox PARC because he then has the technology to make it real. What I really like about this idea of the adjacent possible is that it's not about the boldness of the idea. It's about the feasibility of a new idea, right? So we can all have amazing ideas about flying cars and going to Mars and stuff like that, right? But unless you can implement it, I mean, it's a complete waste of time,
Yeah, I agree. It builds on top of the current ideas that is already applicable, that's already being in use. How do you say that? For example, the incubator, the egg incubator of those chickens in the zoo, that was already existing and it had already a purpose. So the adjacent possible, like exactly like you said, wasn't like, hey, let's make an incubator on Mars or something. It was more like, let's make an incubator for babies because the child mortality was high. Also, really like the idea. It builds on the current products or services which already are being used, but it is the next stage or the next, maybe it could solve another problem or in a different domain, like in the zoo and the incubator example, or in the YouTube example also.
Yeah. For example, you can't have YouTube without broadband, right? If you're using it for dial-up, then it's not going to happen, right? YouTube is only possible because of the adjacent possible in terms of data availability. His point here is that it's environments which encourage exploration for the adjacent possible. That sort of mix of new or the different that facilitates that. And he breaks that down into 6 conditions, and that's really the bulk of the book, is these 6 environmental conditions which really facilitate the adjacent possible. The first one he took is the idea of networks, and he actually goes on to say that he thinks ideas are really created in the mind, in the sense that the brain is a network of neurons, and what it does is that it connects things together in a new configuration, and that's really what an idea is. So therefore, in order to realize the adjacent possible, you actually have to do that in real life. He talks about a study by a guy called Kevin Dunbar, who challenged the fundamental assumptions that scientific breakthroughs are made in the lab. Somebody hunched over a microscope and, I've seen it now, this is the future. And he says, actually, that's not what happened. His studies showed that actually the breakthrough in ideas came within the wider network. So it was sitting in lab meetings and discussing ideas. It was sitting in the break room. And so, the eureka moments come from when those different components of the network are able to offer different perspectives. And he calls it sort of colliding with other people from other disciplines to discover the adjacent possible. I found that really interesting because I can't stand conferences, right? So you go to a work conference, and museums are particularly bad. It's everybody talking about how brilliant they are. Right, I've done this brilliant idea, and the next person gets up and says, I've done this brilliant thing, right? And you're fundamentally disinterested. But actually, if there was a better way to facilitate that said, what's the brilliant part of this idea, and how can you join it with the brilliant part of another idea? It strikes me that conferences would be a much more rewarding experience in terms of innovation.
Involving the participants, maybe involving the people who visit the conferences with those brilliant ideas instead of only presenting in one way.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at conferences are always like, I did this, I did that, this was the impact, right? But actually, it would be much better if they were grouped together and you say, well, here's 3 people talking about X, Y, and Z. Actually, is there a way to combine these together into something new to create the adjacent possible? But that never, ever happens at any conference that I've ever been to. It's always people asking really tedious questions about things that really aren't that important.
Yeah, I agree. And I see also out of my experience in my own company, when they present new ideas is the perfect idea to solve a particular problem, and it doesn't need any changes or something because they already crystallized completely the solution.
Yeah, it's just sort of come down from the heavens, and here it is.
Exactly. Like, this is the perfect solution for all the main problems you guys have. So let's go forward in this way. So the interesting thing is that, like, when you put it in practice, whether it's in an agile way or lean startup, whatever it is, to test it quickly and fail quickly, you see majority of the time it just fails miserably because it's perfectly outlined within the mind of someone, and they promote it like this is the best solution, and in the practice we see that it doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
I recognize it also within my job. It's interesting.
I mean, I suppose a very extreme example of that is I spent a short amount of time working for the UK government, and my broad experiences was that the ministers who are responsible for the particular department are fundamentally disinterested in the idea. What they want is to shape their particular political agenda, right? So you end up implementing ideas that are never ever going to work, but the core of them might have been good. It's never been allowed to evolve, and if it had been allowed to evolve, it's then changed in order to fit this particular MP's sort of a view. It's a very sort of extreme example, but very current in Brexit Britain, where I am. We don't want to dwell on the politics.
The interesting thing is he also mentions, I don't know if it's in this chapter, correct me if I'm wrong, about cafes. That's a lot of innovation also happens in cafes historically. When he mentions, I think, cafes in Italy in the time of Leonardo da Vinci, when I think it was in Milan or something, where it was the capital of a lot of craftsmen who were all together in one big city, coming in cafes, talking to each other. And by having that network, like you said, which you can compare with the network of neurons and within our minds, he explained, it helps people to figure out or discover the adjacent possible. And it's interesting because in that time, you have the Leonardo da Vinci as an example, and he had an expertise on different fields. I don't know if we could assume that he wouldn't live in such a networked city with a lot of craftsmen. So that's an interesting point, because the majority of time, if I also think about the liquid networks, and within my experience also within the current company or with the other companies, majority of time of new ideas are created when I engage with other departments, when I engage with other companies in the same field or outside our field, within different domains. When I engage with them, I come with new ideas, and it really helps me. This first chapter really helps me with my assumption that if you put your mind on a particular problem and put yourself in a room for a whole week, you probably are able to solve a problem because you're intelligent enough. And it really shows that factually, it doesn't even give his opinion. Like, factually, he shows like these are the innovations which happened in networks based on people who are connected to other people outside their domain, within their domains, or connected within different disciplines. That's what I think is interesting within this chapter. I recognize a lot.
Yeah. And the thing about when you're working is that you're working in a particular environment in which it makes networks very, very difficult in order to engage with. So you're stuck in your department. It's very hard to mix, both because physically you might be in a different place, but also politically there are always challenges, right? So people are, I suppose, they are reticent to share ideas before they're fully developed in case they're stolen by other people, right? And that's a different problem, but it is true. Yeah.
When I look back within my experience, I see a lot of people have great hunches or ideas. They assume also, I see, that they are the ones with the perfect solution, so therefore we don't need to share it or something. And the majority of the time, They present it also in that way. Like, this is the solution, point. We don't need any other changes within it.
I've worked in some big museums, right? And for a museum, I've seen a lot of money wasted. I mean, it's pocket change to a large corporate, but for a museum, it's a lot of money on projects that somebody has decided, yeah, this is going to be the future. They're just opposed to critical engagement, right, at all, that would actually improve that idea. And I've literally seen a lot of money, as they would say here, spaffed up the wall on ideas that could have actually been improved right at the start, but because of the internal politics or something like that, then, there's not an opportunity, or there is an unwillingness to engage with those particular ideas, which again reflects on how companies or institutions function, right? You're there to execute something within a set of parameters. And of course, if you're trying to do the adjacent possible, then inevitably you're moving beyond those parameters.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I recognize that a lot within our company also. Yeah. Well, whether it's in one particular department, it's not that the department works as itself. It's not that the department has a product of its own. Majority of the time, within every department, within every product or service they have, it's related to other departments, whether it's within a company or it's related to other customers outside. So when it's 100% factually related to others, you need to involve them. You have to, I see it like a collision, colliding your ideas with others or sharing your ideas with others, which definitely is a need. With one type of expertise within one type of domain, if you find a solution for a project which is related to other domains, then you assume that also works within other domains. That's interesting.
Yeah. The second chapter then, or I suppose the second environmental condition, is this idea of the slow hunch. And for me, this is actually quite profound. And the more you explore it, the more truth I think there is in it. And he challenges fundamentally the assumption of the eureka moment, that innovations happen in a flash in brilliant people who are geniuses, right? And only they could have actually had that. And he talks quite a few examples. So, Charles Darwin is supposed to have had this flashbulb moment reading about Malthus, who was an earlier writer who wrote about population expansion. And then, within the last couple of decades, what's actually happened is that researchers have gone through his notebooks, and what they see is the slow sort of accretion of ideas over a very long period of time that eventually led to this idea of a eureka moment, where all of those sort of things came together in a compelling idea that just sort of made sense. And he also mentioned Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. He didn't invent the internet, but he invented the idea that information sits on the internet and needs to be connected in some way that seems absolutely obvious to us now. But obviously when he was working, that was not the case at all, which is I think a really interesting idea in itself, because in the world that we have today, nobody's allowed to have slow hunches that build up over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also the attitude of a lot of companies. Majority of companies I've seen during my time in Belgium as an innovation consultant, it was like, we're having this training, or this, we are going to read this book, or we're having this coaching of innovation, and therefore within a particular time we have to have new ideas, so we have to discover through these tools. And I agree, this is also a really nice chapter for me, because it shows that innovation has to happen within one domain by one unique person who has an expertise within one field. Even if that's the case, that one person comes up with an idea, it's still being built based on several years and a lot of insights that he had gathered and collected through the course of time. I see this slow hunch also as an insight or slow process which leads you to a new idea or the adjacent possible. It's like the collection of all those insights through the course of years, like Tim Berners-Lee had about the World Wide Web, or Darwin had about his theory. Where other inventors, the majority of time, they had an insight, they collected it, and through the course of time, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he talks about in this chapter about notebooks.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the collection of those insights. He mentioned that the most popular inventors or the innovators in history, like Darwin or Leonardo da Vinci or Albert Einstein, they had always notebooks with them. They wrote down their insights. And when they reread those insights, it like connected those insights again with the new insights they gained, which potentially could lead you to a new adjacent possible. And factually, he shows out and outlines also the adjacent possibles that those innovators discovered through this process.
I mean, for me, it sort of exposed the idea of brainstorming as really a bit of a sham, right? It has to work within such a defined set of parameters. So on Thursday afternoon, you're going to be innovative, right? Because we're going to do this thing, and you got to come up with an idea, right? And that's the nature of work. But those big breakthrough ideas that we probably long for are the product, as you say, of observation, of note taking, and then a sort of rumination process that forces you to think through what that means, to connect it to other things, and so on and so on. It leads to the question, well, how can you accelerate that process? You know, if it is about a slow hunch, can you accelerate the things that make up that slow hunch? Or do you just have to let it happen?
Well, the brainstorming, as he also tells in his book, isn't really the best way to accelerate that process.
It's certainly not.
If I look to my own experiences, the majority of time when I had really good ideas within my businesses, that's helped me to create new products or services. For example, in terms of the slow hunch, in the beginning, I sold only mobile phone accessories. And during the course of time, when I engaged and interacted more with mobile phone stores or mobile phone other wholesalers, I saw within the stores that they had a difficulty in selling those products and services of mine. So slowly and slowly, during the course of time, the more I gained insights about the process, about their selling process, about my products and services, about their systems, I understood that they needed a flow within the whole chain of processes when they would buying a product from me and to selling it and providing a solution for the customer. And all those slow hunches helped me eventually to understand that the store owners or the sellers within the stores didn't need products from me, they need solutions for their customers. It led me to an insight over the course of those years that what I need to do is when I talk to a business, instead of telling them, hey, you need this new product I have from Apple, I need to show them how they could solve their problems with my products and which method they had to follow. But that insight was also built over the course of those years based on several insights within my interactions with them.
I mean, you told me that you used to go and sit in your competitors' shops, right, and watch people.
Exactly. Yeah, I had good relationship also with both my competitors and also with my customers. I would go whole day. I would take off from my company and I would go and I would literally sit behind the counter and would observe how they engaged with their customers. And over the course of time, I learned the majority of those store owners and sellers within those stores, they would literally follow a traditional way of selling. The customer comes in, they say, I need a battery. They would sell it. Done. Over the course of time, I understood and I saw, based on the observation, that the customers would come back. This battery or this cable didn't solve my problem. They would say, what is your problem? Well, my problem is, for example, one customer said that, my son is gaming the whole day and we don't understand why within 2 hours the battery of this phone died. And eventually I stood up because they allowed me also to help them. And I told the lady, like, if you were using your phone, a small phone it was, for gaming all day long, it's impossible to find a battery that will keep the phone going 24 hours.
Yeah, what he needs is an Xbox, right?
Exactly, that's the solution. And but the interesting thing is, it's like the conclusion of that observations was eventually that I had to learn those store owners how they would solve the problems of their customers. When the customer would come in, they, instead of just providing what they ask for, just having a conversation with them and try to identify the problem they have. Yeah. And by defining the problem, it will help them eventually to find the perfect solution. And this was an insight, exactly like you said, based on many I sounded like Trump. A lot of observations from those within those stores.
All right, the next chapter is around the idea of serendipity. He starts by telling the story of this German scientist, Otto Loewi. And actually, it's not the experiment that's important, but what he did was actually, work out the impact of how chemicals are used to have an effect on the body, right? That was what he discovered. Yeah. But what's actually more interesting is the fact that he dreamt it. He dreamt this experiment, and then he woke up at night and he wrote down the experiment. And then when he woke up in the morning, he couldn't read his writing. And then the next night, he had the same dream. And instead of trying to write it down, he just went down to the lab, right, and conducted the experiment. I find it amazing because I never dream. I never can remember my dreams, rather. Paul McCartney, for example, wrote Yesterday in his sleep and then sort of woke up and it was in his head and just sort of found the chords on the piano and actually asked people, thought, oh, this is somebody else's song. Have you heard this? And it took a while in order to click that he'd actually dreamt it in his sleep. It's quite remarkable. And in the book, Johnson sort of laments the lack of serendipity, that our lives are so directed now and technology doesn't allow us to be distracted or to be deviated, that we just get on Google, we search for X, we find X, right? Whereas back in the day, you would have to go to a bookshop, you'd have to go to a library, and there were sort of serendipitous events. And so I suppose the question is, how then do you introduce serendipity? Because it's actually impossible to measure. You can't say, just go and do these random things, because for every 20 of those random things you do, you're going to have a great idea. It's not how it works.
Yeah, and exactly like you said, questions like, are we serendipitous enough? And in his book, he says that the English language is blessed with a wonderful word that captures the power of accidental connection, which he says that's what serendipity is. And I really like the accidental connection words, because he also gives an example of famous innovators which came to an accidental connection of insights would lead them to this discovery of the adjacent possible through, or it was a walk, or it was a long shower, or a soak in a tub. So that was interesting. And he also mentions a book of I think it was Blink from Malcolm Gladwell, that he says that a lot of experienced people or innovators come to a serendipity or a sudden insight after, when they would let go of the problem, or they would, exactly like you said in the beginning, they would go to sleep or go for a walk or start playing music. When they would let go the problem, I wouldn't think the solution or the adjacent possible would be discovered without them being conscious about it. I find it really interesting.
I think there's he mentions, I don't know if it's in this chapter, but it might be a later one, but he does mention the Hungarian-American researcher whose name is unpronounceable to my ears, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi or something like that. He's written this seminal book called Flow, and flow is this state that we get in when the challenge is sufficiently challenging, right, and our skills are sufficiently stretched, that we get into a liminal state whereby we are more efficient in what we do. And I've always used this in my work, like in museums, is that you can't present people with an encyclopedia because it's just too much. You have to present them with enough information, and what you're asking them to do with that information has to be sufficient. And because that puts us in that state of flow, we're open to new ideas. It's like our neurons are fired up, they're connected, we're able to make those connections. And I do wonder if the act of serendipitous or of serendipity is based on this idea of flow, that we are doing something, that we're in a liminal state whereby we can make the connections. It's part of that sort of end point of the slow hunch, right? That everything sort of pieces together in a way that makes more sense than it did if we're actively thinking about it or trying to make those actual connections.
During this chapter, I was triggered to another book of a Dutch psychologist, which has written about the conscious and subconscious part of our brains. And it relates also to this serendipity chapter of Johnson. It argues that when we take a walk or soak in a tub or shower, whatever it is, when we let go of the problem, we give our unconscious mind the space and time to make the connections, to connect all those slow hunches. I think this relates to what and gives example about Part McCartney or Otto Louis, is like they have let go the problem. They are not thinking about it anymore. And their subconscious mind, which is constantly active, connects all those slow hunches together, which gives them after they wake up or during the sleep or during playing the piano or something, the sudden clarity or certainty of the adjacent possible.
Yeah. It puts the benefits of mindfulness, right, and more harmonized living into a different context. You have to sleep enough, right? You have to exercise enough. You have to take care of yourself, because it's actually the subconscious, it's promoting the subconscious connections that result in the adjacent possible. I think that's really great insight.
Yeah, and it shows exactly like you said. It's this chapter also again shows the human part of this. Of coming to the adjacent possible, to the sudden connection based on what happens within our brain. We have to give our brains time, like you said. Sleep is important. Stopping breaks are important. To give our brains the space and the time to make those connections with all those other hunches or knowledge or what insights, whatever it is.
The next chapter is on the idea of error, of making mistakes. And, he lists a long list of people who have benefited from making mistakes. So penicillin, for example, famously discovered when I think it was Alexander Fleming's housekeeper, a lab assistant, whatever it was, let the mold sort of grow. Louis Daguerre invented a certain kind of photography because he put something in the wrong place overnight and so on. And he says, what we really need to develop the adjacent possible is the steady accumulation of error. He says error creates a path that leads you out of your comfortable assumptions. And yet we all know that's true. I mean, it's one of the great tropes, isn't it, of innovation. You have to fail.
Yeah.
You need to fail fast and all that sort of stuff, right? The point isn't to fail. The point is to learn as fast as you can in order to basically say, well, that assumption I had about this was incorrect. I really need to fine tune this, or I need to change it, or it's fundamentally wrong. But, as we'll probably talk a bit later, our school systems are fundamentally not based about learning from error, right? They're based about presenting the right answer.
Yeah.
And even though you show you working out and things like that, it's not really so much about the process. If you think about what our MBA experience was like, it was people were fundamentally disinterested in the process of learning. And, the level of conversation at times, or the level of discussion within the lecture theatre was actually, I felt, shockingly low, because the idea is that there is a right answer and you just present the right answer. And that's how it happens. And of course, the learning comes from, in that case, from the discussion of saying, I have this idea about, and somebody says yes, no, or whatever. And you're actually cognitively forcing yourself to think through what that solution is. In essence, you're wrong, right? You're just accelerating the frequency of the wrongness until you get to a right answer.
Yeah, and he says he has written it down very beautifully, in my opinion. I quote, like, being right keeps you in place, being wrong forces to explore.
Yeah.
And exactly like you say, I remember also when I was in high school or the primary education, besides me questioning a lot my studies, I always find it interesting why there was always one right answer. Also during an MBA, exactly like we have been taught within every educational institution I went to, you were being taught to give the right answer. While in business, in my current job, I see that there is no right answer.
Yeah.
It's like together we start working, we start trying to find the solution, and eventually the solution we find is like part of the solution and solves part of the problem and not the complete problem. Then we have tried to explore it more. And the error chapter reminds me of playing the devil's advocate within meetings. I learned the value of playing the devil's advocate in a lot of meetings. Before that, it was majority of the time from, hey, this is the meeting. The purpose of this meeting is this problem. What do you think? And and everybody would give their insights. And majority of time, the highest manager would say, okay, we are going to this direction. I think this is the solution. And in the past year, I would say in those meetings, like, okay, let me play the devil's advocate. So why were we going to do it? Let's assume that this is going all wrong. I would put an error within the conversation, within a solution, and try to make them explore more the solution or the problem from different views.
Yeah, historically, do you know how the idea of the devil's advocate came up?
No.
Well, obviously, religion played a different role and probably a bigger role in people's life back in the day than it did today. But the idea was specifically to question the assumed wisdom of a decision. So it was about judgments of right or wrong, right? What's the view of the devil, right? And that's why people would present it in that way.
Yeah.
I think, really within innovation, if you're talking about that, the view of the devil's advocate is to say, well, what are the fundamental assumptions that have to be true in order for this idea or this strategy or this product or service to deliver what it's supposed to deliver? Pushing it on from, like you say, there's not one right answer, but you are saying, well, it's only the right answer if these particular things are in place, and then you're in a better place in order to make an informed decision.
Yeah, true.
I mean, he gives the example of a researcher called Charles Nemeth, who's an American psychology researcher. And she did an experiment about word association using colors, for example. So she would get a group and say, if I give you the word blue, what comes into your mind? And of course, most people would say sky or whatever. But a small percentage of people would come up with more esoteric responses. So what she actually did was incorporate error into the groups. So when she would ask people what their association was, they would give completely the wrong answer. So if you said blue, she would say grass. Somebody would say grass or something like that. And actually what happened was that by introducing that definition of error, it prompted greater creativity in other people's responses. So it is about not just having the right answers and the wrong answers, but she says about having noise and signals. And actually, that's messy to manage. But actually, what it does is that it leads to more interesting and more creative responses.
Well, I imagine in that experiment also that those participants who were asked to give deliberately wrong answers forced them to explore other types of answers than the traditional ones, like the blue or the sky or whatever it is. I understand that, because if I would assume a particular answer for a particular problem and someone else would say a complete other answer or give a complete different opinion or reaction, I would definitely start exploring new perspectives to the problem. Why? Because the other answer, which is completely wrong in my opinion, triggers me automatically to think different.
Yeah.
Like if someone says think about something which is blue and someone would say an apple, I would directly be, after hearing apple, be triggered. Like, how would you in the first place come to an answer like an apple? So it would trigger me like, no, it's not an apple, say a plane. Then I would come to a different answer than only the sky is blue. Because I would question it.
So there is this music producer, I mean, he's passed away now, but he worked in the 70s and 80s, called Martin Hannett. And he worked with a very influential band called Joy Division, who are, I guess, there's punk, right, which is the sort of expression of angst. And then there was Joy Division after punk, which was actually a much more nuanced sort of emotional expression. And he produced their first couple of albums. And I remember hearing an interview with the drummer of Joy Division and later New Order, a guy called Stephen Morris, what it was like to work with Martin Hannett. And of course, Martin Hannett would be in the producer's booth and he would say, "Oh, that's great, Steve. Can you just make your drums a bit more yellow, or something like that?" And Steve Morris is like, "What on earth does that mean?"
Exactly.
But perhaps it wasn't about the yellowness. Perhaps it was just about forcing him to try and do things in a different way. I don't know. And that was just his way of expressing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It triggers me to a lot of conversation I have as casual conversation. As a joke, I would answer questions wrong between my friends or family, and it would trigger them to completely different questions. Like, why would you think in such a way, especially in religious or philosophical topics? I will deliberately answer in a wrong way, try to shift the conversation differently. And then recognize exactly like Johnson's talking about. It makes you basically like, and this chapter, it says like error which force you to explore the problem or the solution you have, to explore it differently through a different perspective or dimension or level, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's true. The next chapter is the one on exaptation. He takes it from an essay by Stephen Jay Gould, who's a famous scientist, and Elizabeth Verber. And it's where an organism develops a trait optimized for a specific use, but then the trait gets hijacked for a completely different function. So the example they cite is about bird feathers, right, which evolved to regulate temperature, either to let heat out or to keep heat in. And of course, over the course of evolutionary adaptation, certain birds used it to glide, and then it supported flight, and so on and so on. And it's this idea that we invent something for one use, and then it can only be used for that use for the rest of time, right? And he's saying actually the adjacent possible is about actually just people using those things for completely different uses. And so the example that I thought of when reading this chapter is the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is a bit of a slog to get through today. But at the start of the movie, it's basically these apes doing what apes do. The monolith appears, and the monolith sort of represents the evolution of mankind. And at some point, one of the apes picks up a bone from a dead animal, right, and uses it as a club. And it represents this evolutionary change that humans have to reconfigure the use of things. And again, it's about being open enough to use things in different ways, even if it doesn't work, in order to discover if it does work.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, this in the first time we gave an example of that, I think it was the tires. In one African country, they used tires to make flip-flops.
Yeah. So the tires get worn down, right? That's what happened. The tires get worn down. You can't use them on your car. You sell them on to somebody. They cut them up because they make perfect shoe soles.
Yeah, exactly. And they recycle it basically, or they use it completely for a different purpose. And it is a perfect example how in the development countries there, this principle comes into practice. Yeah. And it forces, I think, eventually, if you would question during solving a problem or trying to find a adjacent possible, if you question the problem or the idea again with how could we use the current products or services or materials we have differently for another purpose, or without even having an idea or a problem, just looking around us, I think we would challenge ourselves to new adjacent possibles if we would question it, just how could we use the things we take as with things we assume that it has already reached its final purpose differently.
I mean, in that chapter, he sort of goes off on one, right? He kind of goes back to the networks idea, but he doesn't call it networks. He talks about weak ties, and he talks essentially about tribes or communities, and that if you are part of a strong tribe or a strong community, you have strong ties, then you're less likely to engage in exaptation. Whereas if you are in a community or many communities with weak ties, what you're able to do is to draw from each of those different communities because you're not so embedded in them. And he gives the example of the coffee houses. This is where he talks about the coffee houses in the Enlightenment in England. There's basically nowhere else to go, right? So they all went to the coffee houses, and it was all these people who were, I suppose, of a particular ilk, had intellectual curiosity and were able to sort of share those ideas. So it's the idea that for innovation to happen, you have to have cognitive diversity, but you can only have cognitive diversity if the ties that bind communities together are sufficiently weak enough to allow diversity into those particular communities.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I always think, that the worst examples of this are political parties, right? Where the ties are so strong and you have to have this particular values and so on and so on and so on, because the leader of that party represents those particular values. Well, that's fine. But of course, no political ideology has all the answers. And so you actually need those weak ties in order to bring in new ideas. And he talks about, Apple, it's a walled garden, right? It's like a fortress, but actually inside the fortress, there are weak ties between the departments. When they engage on a new project, it's kind of chaotic because all those people are trying to work things out, and then they narrow it down to a product, and then it becomes defined, and then the design process actually takes over because you've actually worked out what the product is supposed to do, rather than it become a sort of compromise between many different departments.
And it's interesting how he mentions again the coffee houses, and also goes in the current era of where Apple and Google give time to their employees to connect with other departments about ideas. And I completely agree, and also recognize the fact that you need weak ties to enable to explore the adjacent possible. If exactly like you said, the political parties have strong ties, like you have to believe in these values and norms and whatever it is. And therefore, I would understand that, okay, this is my value, this is my norm, done. I'm not allowed to explore other things outside of these borders of this political party. But exactly like you said, if the ties are weak and the political party would say, this is vaguely our norms, this is vaguely our values, try to comply with it, try to believe in it, and it will be all fine. And I would understand how people would start to explore other norms of value and other things.
Yeah.
And I recognize it, to be honest. Several years ago, I was very active in the Muslim community in the Netherlands. And also in the UK, I was active, and it was interesting. You mentioned political parties, but in the Muslim communities, there are several communities which follow other paths of the faith. Within the Muslim community, you have a lot of subcultures, sub-communities. Right. Each one of them following the Islam on a different way, but the ties are so strong that the majority of the time, or you're seeing that the majority of the community is just following the norms of value which is dictated. People who are escaped from them and just... And the other side, when I see, which is the minority of the Muslim community, there are certain communities where they have weak ties with their members, and they say, just be a good human, try to serve other humans in a positive way from your heart. And I see that they explore new ways how to serve others, which is completely recognizable what Sir Johnson is talking about in this chapter, and which also, in my personal experience, eventually when I had weak ties with that community, I started exploring other faiths like the Buddhism or Judaism, or even no faith spirituality. I went in a spiritual path, tried to figure out where I could find other norms of values or other ways of thinking in life. Exactly, I completely recognize this weak ties idea.
I think just hearing you speak there, I thought about two things, is that as human beings, we have a great need to belong. And of course, in an evolutionary capacity, that was through a tribe, right? You were part of a tribe, either a tribe that it was migrant, and before, we developed agricultural technology, you'd move where the food was, right? You would just follow it around, or follow the seasons around, or something like that. And of course, over time, the tribe became the nation, right? And religion is a big part of that. It represents a set of values and so on, that we're prepared to subscribe to. But at the same time, there's a driver within humanity to shape our environment to our needs. And that's really what the innovation is about, or this adjacent possible is about, that we're seeking solutions to problems that we actually have, because we know that the solutions can't be found in the tribe that we are part of. We have to look outside of that tribe in order to try and find new ideas. That's basically what the process that you are actually going through there as you're exploring different religions, right? It's like it's a subconscious recognition that actually what I need in my life is other things. This particular tribe isn't providing it for me. What I need to develop are ties to other ones in order to provide insight that will, help me find the path towards my own sense of fulfillment or enlightenment or purpose. or whatever whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. I had the feeling to belong somewhere, and I assumed, because I've been raised Muslim, therefore I, I belong to the Muslim community. And eventually, I really had the feeling unfulfilling needs of mine. For example, the need of belonging, the need of being loved, the need of being connected, being heard within the community. It wasn't there. It was just dictating, like, you have to follow these steps, you have to do these tasks in order to be part of this community, and therefore done. You're not allowed to question a lot. If you're questioning a lot, you're at fault, and therefore you don't belong within our community. That was the reason I thought, okay, now it's time, I think, to explore new communities.
I mean, in the past, we've talked about that guy, Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was the inspiration for George Lucas and Star Wars. I quite like his view in that he says, all religions are conceptually true, but historically false, right? Something like that, in that they all contain a path towards enlightenment, but actually, literally, maybe literally is the word that he uses, but literally they're not true. Everything that's written down in the Holy Book as it's written down, did not happen. And, he says the point is really you have to find your own journey, your own hero's journey. You're the hero of your own journey. And, that's really that we know in Star Wars. It's Luke Skywalker's story, right? It's his own path towards enlightenment by becoming a Jedi. We're probably getting off the point slightly, right? For me, that some of the most inspirational things about that chapter in Exaptation is that he talks about two of the most really profound conceptual shifts in our understanding about the sharing of information. Both came as a result of exaptation. They didn't come as a result of this is a genius having a genius idea. And he talks about Gutenberg and the printing press. And Gutenberg had trained in, I think, silversmithing or something like that, but certainly metallurgy. He had those skills to create type out of metal. And actually, the idea of printing also was not new. Chinese printing had been going on for many years before that, but Chinese put a lot more stock on writing as a craft and as an expression. They didn't see the potential for sharing information through printing the way that Gutenberg did when he saw the vintners crushing grapes, with a big machine. And he, at some point, he thought, oh, maybe I could connect my skills with metallurgy with these guys' skills with presses and actually print things. And that was the kind of start of his journey. And if you think of the profound impact that printed matter has had on the history of humanity, I mean, it's quite remarkable. And then you talk about the internet, right? So when Tim Berners-Lee essentially made the World Wide Web, what he didn't think about was you and I in different countries recording a podcast or, working during a pandemic. Here's a solution for a pandemic. It's called Zoom. Or Amazon can now sell you anything over the internet, right? He was just trying to make those connections between research papers, but other people have then gone on to profoundly alter both the printing press and the internet. I don't know. I think there's certainly the background that I come from within museums. It's the uniqueness of the idea. You have to come up with a unique idea every time you engage with people. And actually, well, not really, quite clearly not. You just need to borrow from other areas and integrate that within, the work that you're actually doing.
Yeah, you could call it borrow, and even you can call it combine ideas, insights, or hunches, or other disciplines together.
And that's what the concept of open innovation is based on, right? Is that you are developing lots of ideas internally, but the way that the development funnel works is that only a few are going to get produced. But, if you put them out there, other people will be able to use them, and you'll be able to benefit from licensing, or whatever. But that's really what open innovation is about, facilitating that exaptation.
Yeah, and exactly. It links also to the next chapter, which is platforms. Johnson also talks about how all those new technological platforms enabled everyone else to find and explore the adjacent possible. He gives an example. I think it's the Twitter, which they initially built an API Yeah, application programming interface, which enables you to collect the data, send the data, and eventually went based on the way users use Twitter. It became eventually the way we are using now Twitter.
Yeah. So most people who use Twitter don't use Twitter to use Twitter, right?
Exactly. It shows really in this chapter the beauty of open innovation, the beauty of sharing your idea, your adjacent possible to enable others stumble upon or explore their own adjacent possible. I remember a few years ago when I visited a news company. I don't know when it was. I think it was 2-3 years after Twitter was launched. And in that company, they showed us like, hey guys, I'm going to show you something which we are currently using for within our news research, which is this huge screen. We just open the screen and select a particular country, and you will see all the hashtags which are used within a particular time frame, the most popular hashtags.
Wow. I mean, that's a completely different way of reporting, right?
Completely. And the beauty of it was that when they have developed this concept, they asked the question, okay, is this really a better way of trying to find news within different countries? Is it faster than our traditional way? And then they measured it's even faster, much faster than the traditional way of somebody stumbling upon something, calling a journalist or calling an agency, and the agency is calling the central agency on the other part of the globe and eventually making a news story. Wow. When they measured it, they said that especially within the developing countries where they are starting using Twitter, they saw that they could recognize instantaneously almost what issue or what topic is becoming popular. And that was really beautiful. And it was an example of the Twitter API they used.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, because the skills of the journalist they change from who's your network, who's leaking you information, into accelerated analysis, really. How do you make sense of such a profoundly large amount of information?
Yeah, and the beauty in this chapter of Johnson is it doesn't say platform is the solution or platform is another way for as innovation basis, but it says that platforms will allow you to find not only one adjacent possible, but many other adjacent possibles, and even allow others to connect with your platform, which helps them to find another adjacent possible.
Yeah. That is absolutely true. I mean, he talks about really, that's how ecosystems develop, right? Which takes us kind of back to the starting point with Darwin looking down on the coral reef. Essentially, that the coral is not the ecosystem; it's the platform upon which the ecosystem exists. That's the profound insight.
Yes, exactly. And exactly like the coral reef, he gives an example of the coral reef where all those organisms around the coral reef, the reef itself, are so connected with each other that they eventually grow and into an island or into a whole reef. And exactly like you just talked about the open innovation, he talks also about the ecosystem innovation, whereby platforms are the ecosystems, are the basis of the ecosystems, which could help people explore new innovations or help them solve problems or help them stumble upon new innovation, which is beautiful.
The final chapter, I mean, that's the 6 environments, right? Environmental conditions that he talks about. And then he has this conclusion called the 4th quadrant. And I find this quite a curious conclusion, really. It's less a conclusion and more a sort of justification that he's right.
Yes, I agree.
That seems to be how it is. And he tells the story of this guy, Willis Carrier, who at the turn of 20th century New York, he essentially comes up with this genius idea of inventing air conditioning. And what he works out is that the water will absorb the heat, essentially. And so what you need to do is not actually use steel or something like that, which they had used to cool places, but actually, reconfigure it and use essentially fog or steam or something that goes through the pipe and that absorbs the heat. And this is one of the few innovations that can be considered like the work of a lone genius.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, or whether other things happened around it, well, that's something else. But, his point is that how you see it has a profound impact on how you see innovation and how innovation happens. And so what he does is that he basically draws a four-way diagram, right? So on the x-axis, it's are ideas developed by an individual or by a network? And on the y-axis, it's are they market-driven innovations to generate, I suppose, profit or products or whatever, or are they non-market? They're just driven by, I suppose, the passion of the idea or something like that. He actually goes through all the innovations of the last not all of them, many of the significant innovations of the last 600 years, and sort of charts how they have arisen. In the early days, it's an individual who has a profound idea, not a market-driven idea, because obviously capitalism wasn't invented in the 1400s, but they are individuals who have profound insight. And then actually what happens over time is that the number of networked ideas starts to develop. And actually the major innovations don't come from the market. And in fact, even from, the Industrial Revolution, when we look forward from 1800 to the present, the point is that it's actually the adjacent possible is very much a product of human insight rather than market-driven insight. Not that the market doesn't help to generate incremental improvements, things like that. There are solutions, but predominantly networked ideas drive innovation and non-market ideas drive innovation. And he thinks that's profound. He's an American. He's writing in America. The market is the solution for everything. And actually, he's saying it's much more nuanced than that. It is a product of the environment, not of the driver to create, or the market driver to create. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that was exactly also what I understood from the last chapter. Indeed, the lone genius who would come to an eureka moment and would invent a new product or service which could change the whole world, and is showing that it's really not the rule, but it's the exceptions that eureka moment. This chapter really validates my gut feeling that and also gives an answer why I was never able to come to a breakthrough innovation or create a very radical or a new or a perfect product or a service. Majority of the time I assumed like, okay, hey, I have an MBA, I have a lot of experience in business, I'm intelligent, and therefore I could create a perfect product or the new Apple or the new Microsoft, whatever. And the majority of the time I would become sad and I would say, why I'm not able to do this? Why I'm not able to invent something new or think about something new? And I always question, why was that the case? And this chapter really shows the human side of the innovation process. We as a human being have a basic need to belong to something or to someone. We are human beings connected with each other. We need each other. We live for each other, basically. And factually, that's the networked and non-market innovations are much more than the ones who are marketed or individual market network, whatever it is completely in line with how we are as human beings. Reminds me of all the times I came to good ideas without connecting to people or information sources or the information of other people. In some way, if it wasn't connected with directly, if I wasn't interacting with people, I would interact with the tools or the mediums of those peoples or the platforms of those other people,
right?
Which would lead me to ideas. And it shows exactly in this chart also, takes away certain assumptions like that I had to figure out the next Google or the next Apple.
Right. Of course, the algorithm that drives Google, right, in terms of its search, was a product of a university environment rather than a market environment. And I think one of the points he makes is that markets make everything more efficient, right? But actually, in terms of coming up with new breakthrough ideas, they're not so efficient. The markets make things accessible because you're able to develop a venture or an organization can actually roll those out efficiently, can generate profits from them, which can sustain them. And that's what companies do. Actually, coming up with the ideas themselves is a much more complex affair that the market doesn't naturally support. Not that it doesn't happen in some ways, it clearly does. The other point he makes is that it's about this networked ideas, right? And he points out that communism never would have taken off because it's hierarchical. This, I have the one right idea, and we're going to introduce this. And of course, that ideas have to be networked in order to improve and to refine them. And I suppose the way I took this is that the development of good ideas is a profound human activity. It's based on human insight. It's based on human creativity, and that's why we have to cultivate those things. And then, his final words in the book are, "The patterns are simple, but followed together, they make for a whole that is wiser than the sum of its parts." And he sort of encourages people to then do those things that he has outlined. Go for a walk, cultivate hunches, write everything down, keep your folders messy, embrace serendipity, make mistakes, take on hobbies, frequent coffee houses, develop your networks, follow the links, let other people borrow your ideas, and so on and so on. And because only then can we develop the sort of solutions, the wider solutions, I guess, that humanity needs to its the environmental problems that we're all facing. In terms of the lessons from the book, we've sort of dotted them about, but you wrote down some, I think, quite profound questions about how does it impact on our business and how we function? How does it impact on our education? How does it impact on our own sort of development? If you take what Stephen Johnson is saying as a working theory, as it were, you can buy into that idea, then what are the lessons for business or for companies?
Well, in my opinion, first of all, the way Stephen Johnson has outlined all the 6 principles is based on facts and historical fact. I would change it into questions like I did, like, do companies understand how breakthrough innovations factually happen? Like, a lot of companies could assume, like, okay, the breakthrough innovation, Apple has an R&D, therefore we need an R&D. So, or breakthrough innovation, we need breakthrough innovation. Okay, let's budget it with 2 million, maybe hire new people, hire new tools, or get some subscription to something. Or do companies know how they can accelerate this in the innovation process they have? Do companies understand the cognitive process of innovation? Do companies know how to create innovation culture based on cognitive process of innovation? All those 6 principles he talks about, I haven't seen that until now being mentioned within our company or other companies I follow online. Or it's like you said, Apple is a fortress. You will never hear how they innovate, or you hear not a lot of their innovation process. Or the majority of time I see companies who innovate traditionally, they have an innovation department, they follow trainings, they invest in people, and therefore they try to figure out the next breakthrough innovation.
And the point that I made in my notes is that most companies work in an execution culture, right? You want people to do what they do as efficiently and effectively as possible. And so the process of work becomes so massively streamlined, you're actually ignoring or actively filtering out the things that Stephen Johnson is talking about. Right? Why do you need to be a part of that network? What's that got to do with your job? Or there's no time to leave these things to develop. We need an answer now.
Exactly. Yeah, and they think also in a linear way. Like, we have a problem, let's have a training, let's have a coaching, let's have a brainstorm with all the executives or the most expert colleagues, and therefore we have to find a solution. Done. We have outlined a solution, therefore this is a solution. We have invested 2 months, 3 months, or 1 year in it. Done. This is the solution. This has to be the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that's what they're in the business of, right? And I think one of maybe it's something we can cover in another episode, but it's this idea of the paradigm with which you work in, either as a product dominant logic or a service dominant logic. And a product dominant logic, you're trying to create the best, I guess, either physical product or well-defined service that does a particular job. Whereas service dominant logic is, well, what's the capability that the customer needs from this particular thing, this is innovation. And that means actually questioning whether the product you're doing is actually the best way to deliver that service, that increase in capability, or to realize the benefits. And the point of that, the people who wrote that original article about service dominant logic, and what they were saying was that actually service has always been at the heart of human relationships, human trading relationships. At some point, at a very basic level, the person who grows crops needed something from the blacksmith who makes shoes for the horses. The blacksmith needed something from the farmer, and actually what they were doing by exchanging the goods was exchanging the service, the benefits of actually those products, right? It increases their capability to be a blacksmith by being able to eat. It increases your capability to be a farmer by having your horses have shoes. And over the course of the Industrial Revolution, what happened was that where the products were made became increasingly unhinged from the service that it actually provides. So that's how the idea of a product dominant logic actually developed. And now all we can see is we've got to create the best product that we can, rather than what's the service that somebody needs from that.
That's definitely missing within a lot of what I have experienced, innovation breaks, workshops, brainstorm sessions, or problem solution sessions where we have to find a solution for a huge problem or a small problem. And exactly is the question like, okay, what is it eventually servicing? What is the purpose eventually? What are we solving? What is the customer gaining? Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. It is interesting how he outlined in this graph, Stephen Johnson, all those breakthrough innovations in the past 600 years. What I also have learned from this book is that no product or a service has reached its final state. So, for example, you have the World Wide Web, and the World Wide Web was initially created to structure and connect documents or information with each other. But actually, this book also shows that the innovation process, which leads you to a product or a service or a solution, is a fluid product, service, or a solution.
Yeah, it's never in a final state, right?
Exactly. It's never in a final state. And so it's a state where you maybe can market it, maybe it can introduce it in a market or something, but eventually it is an adjacent possible, not a final adjacent possible. It's an adjacent possible.
It's like the example I've always seen is, and I think you might mention it in a book, but I've heard it in other places. It's when a liquid changes to a solid. When water turns to ice, it's not just a binary thing. You can actually see the physical state changing under a microscope. The molecules of water take on a different shape, and then at some point it becomes hard, right? I suppose with innovation it's actually the reverse, right? You're taking something that's hard and it's becoming actually more fluid. I really like that analogy, or rather his environmental conditions represent that fluidity before something takes on another solid shape.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know who said it, but it was this quote: "You should be always like water, fluids to be able to fit in different shapes. Water is able to take many shapes if we want. If we put it in a cup, it takes the shape of a cup. So there's innovation, like you said, it's as if we try to find the new cup or the mold which the product, service, or solution would fit in. And it's not the final state because it's fluid and not a definitive final state of its own.
Now, you raised some questions also around education and personal development. Yeah, education is the sort of hard end of personal development, right? Because if you think about how our education system developed, before the Industrial Revolution, it was very fluid, right? You were probably taught the basics, and then you became an apprentice and you learned on the job how to actually do something. And then during the Industrial Revolution, what happened was we need millions of people to work in factories. What's the minimum standard that these people need to be educated in order to take their place on the factory line? And that's by and large how state education developed, and that was its fundamental purpose. And if you think about the Western world and how we're changing, ideas are the economy, right? That's the point he's making, is that we're going from this 10-10 ratio, right? It takes 10 years to develop something. It takes 10 years to roll it out and monetize it. But now if it's 1-to-1, is the education system appropriate for that kind of economy that we're actually living in? You know, going back to your idea of, well, why couldn't I come up with a good idea that I want to turn into a business? I come from a good family, come from a middle-class home, I've had an education, but why can't I still develop that idea? Well, because the education system doesn't actually help support the development of good ideas. So yeah, it helps you to be able to repeat other people's ideas verbatim.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the reason I wrote those questions, like, does the educational institutions understand the value of note-taking or the cognitive process of coming up with ideas? Instead of teaching children definitive state of answers, teaching them that it's not definitive state of answer. It's like, it's fluid. It's a state which could go to the next step. Or I must say, in the past several years in my personal development and education, I learned more from my own note-taking exercises or online educational videos or online blogs or wikis I learned or research papers I read online or the books I read. I learned more from that than education. Why? Because I took time to learn, to read it, and afterwards think about the practical value of it. Try to see and connect it with what I do in a daily basis. And especially about note-taking, which Steve Johnson talks about in his book, that is really important when you want to follow your hunches into a complete insight. And when you want to reach a serendipity, following your hunches based on note-taking. Well, I haven't been taught about note-taking. Majority of time it was like, you have to take notes now to understand the exercise you have to finish for tomorrow or next week.
Yeah, it's an aid memoir, right? It's like, this is what I need to know in order to get past stuff. I mean, my own note-taking, I like the idea of notebooks, but what tends to happen is I write down things without context. And then when I look back on the notes, I'm like, I don't know why I wrote this down. It was obviously important enough to write it down, but I have no memory as to why I wrote it down or thought it was actually important. And then you're like, well, why am I even writing this down?
Yeah, exactly.
Even the note-taking is driven by an internal motivation. And I'm not sure enough of us have an internal motivation or are sufficiently interested in the world around us in order to actively do such note-taking.
That's a good question. In my note-taking process, it started actually, to be honest, when we talked about note-taking, and I wasn't taking notes personally. I was just taking notes because for my studies. And afterwards, when I went to Belgium to work for Board of Innovation as an innovation consultant, they gave me a notebook and they say notes are very important for your self-development. And that was the only message. And afterwards, I had to figure out what that meant and how I would do it. I would take notes from everything I would find interesting. And afterwards, when I would read it, I would get confused. Why did I write this? And I wouldn't have any context to understand it. So what I did is eventually change my note-taking method for within a business context. Whenever I read a book or read a paper or read a theory, eventually I will try to visualize it. For example, if you have the business model canvas, it's a canvas you can print out. But because I have read the book, whenever I see the framework, I would be remembered by the book again, not in detail. And besides that, I think it was 1.5 years ago, I started taking notes about quotes which would make me think about my personal life or personal development. I would write that in a separate book. That helped me a lot. After reading this book, I'm like, how am I able to write those hunches which could lead me to the adjacent possible of something? I clearly don't know.
So I use a tool now called Scrivener, which is a writing tool. It's what you can use to write books, basically. It has less functionality than a word processor and a different functionality in terms of connecting ideas and making cards and things like that. Because I find that unless I am trying to explore the idea, I'll forget it. And the way I have to explore the idea is to be able to write it. And the process of writing is the process of exploration. And And by writing it, that's the cognitive change that will actually happen. So I have many files that are just, I'll probably never look at again, because it's the process of actually working out what's my view on this particular thing and what's the value of it in the hunch that I'm sort of carrying about at the time. And I think I have to type because my writing is so poor and because my brain works faster than my hand. So can't write it down. It just doesn't work. So for me, I'm not copying down other people's ideas. The typing is the cognitive process by which I am trying to make sense of a particular subject.
Has that exploration with that tool helped you to stumble upon new ideas?
It's helped to connect the dots of the slow hunch.
Nice. No, that's nice.
So a couple of years ago, I had that cycling accident, right?
Yeah.
And after I had the cycling accident, I was started to write down ideas around innovation within museums, right? And I actually wrote a book, 90,000 words, asked some people to read it, and some people hated it, and some people loved it. And I was trying to work out afterwards, why was that the case? Why were some people just so violently opposed to what I'd written?
Yeah,
and that's when I started using Scrivener to actually explore some of those ideas, and those ideas led to an interest in the paradigm that we work in, how value is created within a wider economy, and so on and so on. And so what I have is probably another 20 or 30,000 words of actually exploring the concepts related to that. And I suppose if you collect those together, they are part of the slow hunch, the development of the slow hunch.
That's really nice. Well, it makes me think now, the semantic search functionality of a software Steven Johnson talked about in his book. Then when you would search, it will find all those articles, quotes, or whatever you have saved, which is related to that topic, even if the word isn't exactly the same.
You have to label them first, presumably.
Yeah, probably. I'm curious whether if it's possible to pick an idea. For example, let's look at the pandemic and see, okay, has closed down a lot of barbershops. Let's innovate in that space. Let's try to write down our hunches and take our time, because the pandemic is not going away tomorrow, and try to figure out a solution. Will that lead us also, like Steven Johnson has factually written down, that has helped a lot of innovators to break through innovation? That would be an interesting experiment, I think. Wouldn't you think?
Well, I suppose barbershops is probably not the best idea, but food is probably a better idea for the pandemic. So what we've seen is fundamental shift in the hospitality industry. The idea of eating out has changed. So eating out has different functions. It's about eating different foods that you wouldn't normally have at home. And it's also about the conditions that drive that and the experience of doing it, right? So you go out and eat for your birthday or because you want to socialize with your friends, and then the experience is shaped by that. And you want the food to be relatively affordable because it's not about the food, right? The food facilitates the wider experience that you wouldn't have if you just met on a park bench. But now, of course, all those jobs are changing. How do we do that? So I thought one of the most innovative things that I'd seen during the pandemic was some totally random cafe in an obscure town in England or the UK. They said, right, well, we can't sell people sandwiches anymore because there's nobody working. What we can do is sell people a picnic hamper, right? So you tell me how many people you want your picnic for, what things you want in it, and I will, in terms of vegetarian or whatever, right? And you can either pick it up or we'll deliver it to you for a particular price. Because people wanted to go to the park. It was the only way they could socialize with their friends or family. And so the food was still doing that, but it was doing it in a very different way that was appropriate for the environmental conditions. Similarly, you've seen an increase in, Uber Eats and Deliveroo. The job doing is how do you get diversity of the food, right? Because we're all sick of eating pasta the 6 ways that we actually know. So I think there has been sort of innovation within that, whether it lasts or not, and certainly I don't know if Uber Eats do it, but Deliveroo have their own kitchens. So it's not about the restaurant anymore. It's just with half a dozen food stations at it, and the different restaurants or food providers hire it out, and they make their food at those particular stations, and that's what comes through because there's enough demand in order to justify having people working at it all the time or within certs, right?
Well, the picnic example you gave that started by that restaurant was the adjacent possible of the pandemic and the change of the human need.
Exactly, yeah. Whether the person who ran it had it in a moment of genius, or whether she was walking around thinking, oh my God, my business is going to go under. What can I do? And she started to connect the dots. So it's not exactly a slow hunch. It's still a hunch. In both those cases, either the cafe or the Deliveroo example or whatever, they're only feasible with the platform.
It connects each other, the kitchen, the food, the people, everyone.
Yeah, so they can only sell it because there's platforms online. They're also exaptation, aren't they? Because they're borrowing from what's come before, but they're using different means to do it. Perhaps that one's less sort of strong, but the Deliveroo example is an exaptation of that, right? Instead of having one restaurant that makes the food that goes to takeaway, the volume is now such that we can forget the restaurant bit. We'll just have the cooks in one warehouse producing food that's made by Domino's or McDonald's or, Wagamama or whoever it might actually be.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting book, I must say.
Well, there we are. Yeah. So, I think we've covered that in quite some detail. Any final thoughts about Stephen Johnson?
Well, I think he has written a great book. It confirmed a lot of assumptions I had. It took away a lot of assumptions I had. It calmed me down because I was in a hurry to find the next multi-million-dollar business. And now I'm like, Wais, calm your ass down, sit down, take your time.
I did that course on corporate innovation, and I did find quite interesting is that entrepreneurship tends to be based around the expertise that you already hold. So you're either stupid enough to try something that nobody's done before, and you develop expertise based on that, or you're already an expert on a subject, but you're willing to experiment and do the adjacent possible.
Exactly.
But it's not just about, the technical skills or the business end skills, right? It has to come from something else.
Exactly. And that's definitely what I'm going to do afterwards, is that try to write these 6 principles in such a way down to make it part of my future experimentations.
And I'd be interested to know people who have had those ideas. So if you took Google and their original algorithm, it's the adjacent possible because there were other web search tools available, right? So back in the midst of time, Alta Vista, Ask Jeeves, I'm sure there were others. Right. So it was the adjacent possible. It was just a more efficient way to do it. It happened in a liquid network, right? Because they were in a university environment.
Like Facebook. Yeah. It was a network in a networked environment, which helped them eventually to find the adjacent possible.
Yeah, it was a slow hunch, right? Serendipity. I don't know if there was in the Google story. I don't know, but there was certainly error, right? Well, it's an interesting way to think about it, but it's also we don't want to do it that way, right? We want to have the genius moment.
True. It's possible to have the genius eureka moment to a new breakthrough innovation, but now I'm definitely going to be careful.
It's hard, isn't it? You don't want to focus just on one idea, right? Because that's stupid, because you've got a high chance of error. What he's presenting is like a way of living for new ideas, but each of the examples also has a specific area in which it operates.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So he talks about science, he talks about technology, the natural sciences in terms of Darwin. They're not about technical things. They're more about how to cultivate a personality of innovation. So in the book, he talks about the best innovators have multiple hobbies, right? Because they just can't focus on one thing.
Multiple hobbies, multiple interests in different fields within a job even.
And the fundamental problem with work, right, is that they just want you to have one interest. Just be the best business analyst, be the best educator. And of course, that's fine. But moving beyond that, you have to have a wider range of interests to realize the potential of business analysis, right? You have to know how to engage with humans. You have to know how to engage with data. You have to know how to engage with process, and so on and so on. You have to have those wide range of interests in order to develop.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, then. Well, I think it's safe to say we can both recommend Stephen Johnson's Where Do Good Ideas Come From?
Definitely a recommendation for anyone who works in an environment where you need new ideas, or even in personal development. It's definitely one I should recommend because it takes away a lot of assumptions which I grew up with, to have the killer idea that will make me rich eventually. So it's helpful both in the business and personal level.
Hi, Alex here. I'm back to close out this episode of the Innovation Book Club with a few prompts and questions to take your learning further. Before we start, however, here's a quick note about why we're actually doing this. We believe that the value of learning is not in knowledge acquisition. Its value lies in the reflection process. When you judge the value of the knowledge that you've been exposed to, you understand how that analysis changes your view of the world, and then ultimately how that knowledge and understanding increases both your capacity and capability to engage with and shape the world around you. So to that end, what we've done is we've come up with a few questions to help you reflect on what you've just heard and to try and push you on with your own innovation learning journey. So here they are. Number 1. In this book, Stephen Johnson defines innovation as the adjacent possible. In this case, adjacent refers to a new idea and possible refers to ideas that can be physically realized in the real world. Is this definition too simplistic to be useful? Why or why not? 2. Stephen Johnson makes the case that all new innovations are a product of their environment, and that is dependent on 6 particular conditions. And they are liquid networks, the slow hunch, serendipity, error, exaptation, and platforms. So which of these conditions do you think is the most convincing? And which do you think is the least convincing? Why? And finally, Stephen Johnson argues that non-market and networked ideas have become the primary source of new innovations. How does knowing this change your perspective on the development of your own ideas? These questions are also in the podcast notes, together with additional links if you'd like to read or watch something else related to this episode. Good luck with your answers and let us know how you get on. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Innovation Book Club. If you've enjoyed this episode, then you can do 3 things to help us grow our audience. First of all, please leave us a 5-star review on your podcatcher of choice. This helps to feed the algorithm. Second, share this episode with your friends and colleagues if you think they would benefit. And finally, if you'd like to listen to all future episodes of the Innovation Book Club as soon as they're available, then please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, take care and we'll be back soon.